Well, thank you very much, Seabstian, for the nice invitation, and thanks to all of you for sticking with us through these 2.5 very long days. I know, well, one of my colleagues once said, well, 10 hours of lecturing, well, that's not a problem, but 10 hours of listening, no, that's not possible. But you've shown that obviously it is possible for some of you still. Okay, I'm supposed to talk about how to promote alternative macroeconomic ideas, and I've titled my presentation, Are There Limits to Running with the Mainstream Pack? And this is a bit provocative, I guess, and running with the mainstream pack here refers to using mainstream models. I'm explicitly not talking about using mainstream methodology. I have a different view on using econometrics than on using the models, but we can discuss all of that later. So I will start with defining running with a pack a bit more closely, and I'll present you some examples where I have observed this kind of running with the pack both in research and in the writing of textbooks. Then I'm going to discuss what running with the pack can do for you and for, well, the greater good to promote policy ideas. Then I'll turn towards some problems you might get with running with the pack. And, well, because time is limited and we are supposed to talk not for too long, I'm going to just limit this to one example and talk about austerity here. Then I'm going to move on and move a bit away from economics towards the philosophy of science, and will ask in how far is running with the pack a good idea if one looks at the theories of Thomas Kuhn and the idea of scientific revolution. Finally, I'll very briefly talk about alternatives, and then I'll conclude. So let's start. What exactly is running with the pack? And my definition here is that running with the pack is if you use mainstream macroeconomic models or significant elements thereof without explicit critical distance to promote your economic policy ideas, which usually are found in alternative economic approaches. And, well, if this is too abstract, I've come up with a slide to present or to have some examples here. Before I bring up the names here and the titles of the papers, or at least the topics of the papers, let me give you a small disclaimer here. These papers here, they are all great papers. And I've chosen them because they are great papers, because they have influenced the public policy debate, and I envy them all for the sophistication of the paper. And some of them are written by very close friends of mine, so this is not to placate them, but I think you know some of them, and some of you are in the audience who have written some of these papers, so this might lead to a more lively debate later. Let's start on austerity. On austerity, there is this paper by Ranneberg, Schroeder, Strasky, 2015. As I said, it's a very interesting and good paper, and it shows you in a DSGE model that the multipliers for fiscal consolidation are much bigger than previously thought when you take into account both the financial accelerator and liquidity-constrained households. My second example is on inequality, also people who are well known in this network, Gröning, Theobald, van Treek, 2015, and they use a DSGE model to show something they also show in other models, in other papers, but here they use this DSGE model to show that growing inequality can lead to growing external imbalances. And then the third paper I have here is on endogenous money versus loanable funds theory, and this is the Jakob Kumhoff paper, 2015, a Bank of England paper, which uses a DSGE model to show that if banks create money through lending, which many of us believe, then financial shocks become much more important and can explain much more of the crisis. Again, this is a policy conclusion which many post-Keynesians would follow, and this has been now put in a mainstream model. Let me now turn to the examples from teaching. In teaching, there's the core project. Many of you might have taken a look at that, and there's been in the community a big debate about the funding and the whole issue of this core project. And if you go into this textbook, and this is financed by INET, I think, part of it, and it is a big initiative, and they tried to come up with an alternative economics textbook, which is then supposedly used, well, in as many departments as possible. It's free to use, it's online, and it has all the lecture resources which you would expect from a good textbook. What struggles me is that if you really go into this textbook, it has some issues like inequality and ecological limits and so on in it, but it fails to mention different paradigms. It doesn't discuss that there are different paradigms. You get an alternative view, which is a bit different from other textbooks, but the basic idea that economists might not really agree about, well, very fundamental issues, this is missing from this textbook, and I was very surprised to see that an alternative curriculum would do it this way. Especially when you look how they explain the Keynesian model, you would probably not be happy, or many of you would not be happy with that, because they start from a household which maximizes utility by adjusting consumption to changes in interest rates, and in their model, this is the main driver of the business cycle. Again, this is not necessarily what we would, or what many here would think is a good depiction of the economy. Even though, if you go into the DSGE models, this is an important channel of transmission of monetary policy. The second example, which I have brought you, is the Karlin Soskit textbook, Macroeconomics. It has, I would say, if you really look at it, it has a lot of traditional Keynesian elements in a three-equation model. But what these authors do is they, in a way, try to imply that what they present is the modern mainstream model. So they take a Woodford quote about mainstream modern monetary framework in order to support their own model, even though the models are very, very different in their foundation and in how they work. So again, they fail to really discuss the difference of their view how the economy works and the mainstream models. So my question is this a good strategy? Should you do this? And if you ask a question like that, of course, the first counter question would be, well, good strategy for what? And so we first have to take a look, what do you do academic macroeconomics for? And I've tried to compile a list. I hope I have at least found the main important or the most important motivations. And I would start with, and they are not ranked. You can rank them for yourself. But one might be that you want to spread economic policy ideas. You might see that austerity is harmful and hurts a lot of people, so you might want to spread the idea that this is not the best strategy to bring down debt and stabilize an economy. So you want to spread that maybe among other academics and maybe towards policymakers, if you want to inform and influence policy. The second the second motivation for doing academic macroeconomics is pedagogy. I mean, we all have to teach, so we want to explain to students how the world is working. For that, we need models, and we use the models to explain that. The third motivation is that you want to maybe improve policy evaluations and give tools to policymakers, and maybe some of you might want to help making economic forecasts. And finally, there's one motivation which, well, you probably wouldn't admit that you want to put it very high up on this list, but for some people it is very important, and it's for some it's just a matter of survival, that you want to enhance your academic career. So, and if you do go, and I'll now go through these things and try to see what running with the pack can do for you. And actually, there might be some merits here. First, your ideas might be easier accepted by the mainstream. You might get reputation among the mainstream. You get good publications. We talked a lot about publication lists and points here. So you might get into a better position at a better university, more resources for research, and then you can better spread your ideas. So maybe the idea is a bit like the wolf in sheep's clothing. You try to get into the flock of mainstream economists, and then you do there what you want to do, and maybe to the disadvantage of this old mainstream. Okay. So this might be a strategy which works on these dimensions, but I think there are some problems with that. And I will now talk about austerity. And in order to do that, I'm going to contrast the working of the original DSGE model and the effect of a cut in government expenditure and deficits with a more modern DSGE model. This is not the complete model I talked about earlier, which our colleagues have put together, but the alternative model, I'm just talking about one channel, which is now in these more modern DSGE models. But let's start with the traditional DSGE models. If a government cuts expenditure and deficits in a traditional DSGE model, the effect is that output contracts, but private consumption goes up. Why is this? Well, there are two first round effects. Reduced government demand leads to lower real wages. This is how that works in a model, because nominal wages are usually flexible in the basic DSGE model, prices are not. So if you have less demand for labor, the real wage goes down. The second effect is households see their lifetime income increase, because if the government has less deficits today, they need to tax less tomorrow, so lifetime income goes up. This is Ricardian equivalence. And so how now do these utility maximizing rational households react if they see these two things? Well, they first will, because their lifetime income has increased, they will consume both more goods and more leisure time, because the two things enter into their utility function. The leisure time is translated into households offering less labor, because there's less labor offered, there's less production, so GDP goes down. But at the same time, households increase current consumption. So output contracts, but by less than the government cuts and by less than what traditional Keynesian models would tell us. So smaller multipliers than what we would expect. And by the way, smaller multipliers than we have seen empirically. And for all of those who have done empirical economics, usually it is not that if you cut government spending and deficits that private consumption goes up, but usually it goes down. And we have had in Europe a few, I wouldn't say natural experiments, but outright experiments which have confirmed this trend in the past years. So let's look what the new DSGE models are doing. Well, in order to get around this empirical problem, they have introduced a number of households which are liquidity constrained, and they call them rule of thumb consumers. And they are liquidity constrained in a way that they can neither save nor borrow. So they spend all the money they earn. They are still rational in the way they offer their labor. So if the real wage falls, they offer less labor, but then they also spend less. Yeah? So when they are confronted with this cut in government expenditure, they offer less labor and spend less. And if you have enough of them in the economy, then you come to a conclusion where you get traditional Keynesian effects. That means if you cut expenditure and deficits, GDP and consumption goes down. So the multiplier here gets larger, and we have moved closer to the empirical observation. So what is now the problem if you use such a model? When you can do that, you get that published. It's now even has moved into, I would say, standard DSGE models now have these rule of thumb consumers in it. I think there are three problems here. The first problem is that if you use this model for teaching, you have to explain this to your students, and you explain that the business cycle is a reaction of the households to changes in the real wage. And you can do that, but I'm not really comfortable with doing this. The second is you might get very questionable policy conclusions, because what this model is telling you is that austerity is harmful because households cannot borrow. So what is a very straightforward policy conclusion? Well, make consumer credit easier. Yeah? If you do this and you combine austerity with offering ample consumer credit, then austerity gets less toxic. Again, this is something I wouldn't necessarily want to stand up and recommend. But the model has exactly this type of conclusion in it if you do it this way. And the third is that, frankly, I would doubt very much whether this model is able to make decent predictions about the future. And the problem here is that the DSGE models, which many of you might not be aware, they are not at all immune to the Lucas critique. Because Lucas, even though some people claim differently, if you go to this article, he's not saying you need microfoundations, but he's saying you must not make macroeconomic predictions with a model which doesn't have microfoundations of which you are absolutely sure that they are constant, unchanging, and correct. If you look at the literature, there are by now some papers who are testing whether the deep parameters in the DSGE models, which supposedly are there for eternity, which are what Lucas says, that the structural parameters, if you really go to the data, you find that they are moving over time. They are not stable. So the standard DSGE model are not immune to the Lucas critique. And so I would also think they are probably not very good for forecasting. Okay, so to summarize this part, what can running with the pack do for you? It might help you spread your ideas among other academics. It will enhance your academic career. Maybe if policymakers look at where you stand in the universities, it helps you to spread your ideas to policymakers. But I think for explaining economic mechanisms and improve policy evaluation and forecasts, this is not a very helpful strategy. Now let me come to another issue which I think makes running with the pack slightly problematic, and this is if we look at the philosophy of science. And many of the post-Keynesians and the other pluralist economists like to talk about Kuhn's structure of scientific revolution. To remind you, Kuhn is saying, well, science uses paradigms. And the paradigm in Kuhn's vision is a social construct. So it's just something scientists have agreed upon to use as a framework for thinking and framing their research. In normal times, scientists try to improve the paradigm by small additions and changes. This is what Kuhn calls normal science. But at some point, these models might run into large problems, and then, well, explaining empirical observations, and then you might have a paradigm shift where everyone says, well, this wasn't such a great paradigm, and this is then the scientific revolution. And the prime example, which is also given in Kuhn's writing, is the shift from the Ptolemaic worldview, where the world was in the center of the universe and everything else was going around it, to the Copernican revolution. And to remind you of this, this here is the worldview before the Copernican revolution. In the middle you have the blue planet Earth, the sun is circling around, and then Mars is circling around with a slightly complicated trajectory. The trajectory was necessary because you needed to bring the empirical observation in line with what you observe with the model. So what they did, and for each of the planets, they devised a very complicated trajectory. And actually, this was a quite complicated model. And if you want to have a short summary, you can go to Wikipedia, where they have a table explaining the basic ideas of the movement of each of the planets. But it was pretty good in explaining what they observed. So I read that, I didn't check that, I'm not a physicist or astronomer, but for 1,000 years they could pretty well predict what they saw on the sky, at least for a number of planets here. And whenever they found something which didn't fit, they just adjusted a little bit this trajectory, and it fit the observations again. However, at some point, this was at odds with other physical observations, so it was very difficult to reconcile all the trajectories with the new ideas of gravity and so on. And so then we had the Copernican revolution, which is how, or at least it's close to how we see the universe today. So now some of the critics of DSGE models would say, well, basically what these scientists doing with the rule of thumb consumers, financial accelerators, and so this is something like this. You observe something and you add a little bit more of loops into the trajectories, and you get this closer and closer to empirical observations, but it still doesn't make this a good model, even though you are able to predict certain empirical observations with that. However, I think the issue is not that easy. I mean, if you see it that way, it's very simple. But sometimes it's not time for a revolution, but for normal science. And there's also an example in astronomy. And this is, in the 19th century, they found out, or scientists found out, that the position of Venus and Uranus, this was strongly at odds with what Newton had predicted, and which the first ideas of this Copernican worldview predicted. And what they did then is they didn't throw away the whole model, but they made some calculations. They said, well, there must be another planet, and they discovered Neptune. So the question is now, is what we are having here and what we are seeing in economics, is this a moment for a revolution or for normal science? And actually, this is something which is at the moment also discussed among our mainstream colleagues. There seem, especially over the past 2 years, there has been a number of contributions of economists which seem to call for a revolution. And if you look at Krugman's writings on DSGE, this sounds more like a call for a revolution, even though we might not like, or not everyone might like, this kind of revolution. Paul Romer, in his very polemic 2016 paper on DSGE models, Brett DeLong has pitched in, some people from the Fed, and Robert Solow went on record in 2010. But on the other hand, we have a number of people who are in favor of an evolution, and I just named 2 of them here. There are many more. For the German colleagues, for example, Rüdiger Bachmann, the person in charge for a young scientist at the Verein für Sozialpolitik, the mainstream economics association. He's very much in favor of a very slight evolution of this model. But Blanchard is as well in his paper, which some people say is not very logical in its argument, and when Lewis also is one of the economists even critical of the models as they're used today, saying evolution is okay. So why I'm going back to this? Because if you run with a pack, implicitly you support this camp here. Because if you use DSGE models here, mainstream macroeconomic models, at least implicitly you say they are okay. At least you will never write in your paper, if you want to get it published, I'm using a completely nonsense model, DSGE, which is used in the literature, and I'll show you that I can get this or that result. You usually show, I take a standard model, we have added a standard financial accelerator, and we get these very interesting results. Okay, so I think the question is, are you really, if you do this, are you the wolf in the sheep's skin, which tries to get into the sheep flock and, well, find some food for himself, or are you the sheep under the wolf's skin, and as soon as you get into the pack, well, at some point they'll find out and they will nourish on you and they will make the pack just stronger. Okay, so what are the alternatives? I think there are some. I think first, the heterodox economists should build alternative models, and we have seen a lot of that over the past 2 days here. I'm sure they are not all where we would like to have them, but I think it's a good strategy to work on that. I think it's also important to work with up-to-date empirical methods. So this is what I said earlier. I think this criticism doesn't apply to mainstream methodology. I think heterodox economists need to be strong there. They need to be able to criticize the empirics when they are weak, but they also should be able to use them when this is possible. They should present good empirical studies underlying non-mainstream results and try to publish them in mainstream journals. Sometimes that's possible. They should confront the mainstream with empirical failures, but in teaching they should highlight the paradigmatic differences and not just put them under the carpet. And they should communicate the, if you do this, hopefully superior empirical results to policymakers. But as I said earlier, the Ptolemaic worldview was also able to explain certain things, so maybe for a while these things are not empirically superior. Okay, let me come to my conclusions. I think running with the pack has some real merits, and I don't want to discount that. It helps to have academic success, and it helps to establish to someone in more mainstream department. It helps to secure resources and positions, which is very important, and which might even be the necessary condition for survival. It might help you to transmit economic policy ideas into the mainstream. That also might have some merits, because in the end you can say, well, whether austerity is relaxed because people understand the real effect or just see the DSGE model doesn't matter. So there might some real positive effect from this, but it comes with some risks. It blurs the difference between paradigms. It forces you to work with questionable foundations, and but this is something everyone has to decide for him or herself. I think it is of questionable intellectual honesty here. Thank you very much.